Good evening. Welcome to Catching Up Life. I'm your host, Gravely Angson, and our top story tonight, the family. I'm sure you've noticed relating to each other in new ways. We are living alone, unmarried, childless, or child-free if you prefer, and we're living for longer. We are living with our partner's children, with strangers and siblings, with multiple generations in the same home. Fundamental Western ideas of family now go beyond genetic ties, a safe haven from the world, or a building block of society. Look around. Most of the architecture around you was based on a society that saw itself as more homogeneous than the world we live in now. Demographic changes, new technology, political and cultural shifts have multiplied and diversified the meanings of basic parts of life. Every day, we are confronted with new and sometimes contradictory values. So, how is architecture keeping up with all these changes? Tonight, we look at the family. Once upon a time, a family was assumed to be nuclear: mama, papa, a son, and a daughter. And today, for many people, the family is still the basic building block of society. But what is a family today, and what does it mean for architecture? Here are some stories we've been following. Nowadays, we are always online. We can contact anyone, anytime, and anywhere with an internet connection. And online, it's normal to share a digital space with people you don't know. But these connections all depend on invisible, physical bubbles. People standing close together, but isolated by smartphones and other devices. It's becoming normal to be solitary and social at the same time. Meanwhile, in Japan, a family rental industry has emerged. You can hire a performer to play a role that can last from a few hours to several years. Sometimes the rentals satisfy specific public needs, but often they serve a simpler desire for intimacy. Why not both? At the same time, in North America, more and more parents are moving in with their kids because they can't afford housing and they don't have retirement plans. And there is a boom in co-housing projects that cater to these new needs. But how can we tell which projects are just selling you a new, more contemporary way of life? So what do we need? New architecture or new ways of using what already exists? Let's go to the streets and find out what some completely random people think.
How do I want family to change in the future? I think that family is fundamental to anything and everything, and especially crucial to a thriving society. I believe that how we define family has evolved a lot over the last century, but young people are still often undermined, and this can really start at the root of the household. I hope that moving forward, the roles of children change in such a way that allows for more autonomy and decision making in their lives. And another big thing, and this relates directly to democracy, is reversing the norms of the family to reflect the values of the future generations. So basically switching the voting patterns in the family so that parents and grandparents vote with their children. And this way, the politicians elected and the legislation passed reflects what we want to see in the world going forward, and not, our old and outdated conventions.
家と学校のどちらが家族にとって大切ですかという問いについてですが、私の答えはやはり家かと思います。家は家族一人一人が自分を養い取り戻す砦のような場所です。まず家が落ち着き安全で安らかな場所であることは私たちが健康でいるために欠かせません。もちろん学校やその他のサードプレイスも人によっては家のような役割を果たしていることもあると思います。でもそれはあくまでも家の代わりを求めているということであって、人々は家というものを求めているのじゃないかなというふうに思います。
Yes, I hope we're finally willing to abolish the violent borders that we've drawn around the so-called nuclear family. For me, growing up in Addis Ababa meant always hosting, and always expanding the definitions of family but also refusing any separation that might exist between the home and the neighborhood. And I hope we're willing to abolish ideas of individual ownership that have always been anchored by the patriarchal foundations of the nuclear family. I hope we can build on Julius Nyerere's notions of familyhood or ujamaa, potentially hybridized with Achille Mbembe's notion of peoplehood, which goes well beyond the human and engages with the non-human, the born and the unborn, the living and the dead. And it really anchors us and embeds us within the planet. I also think we should reclaim the discipline's promise of togethering that goes well beyond national borders and privatized enclosures, which have always been extractive and which have always been predicated on systems of subjugation. So yes, I hope we're willing to abolish the nuclear family and move towards ideas of stewardship and care.
Well, there are several types of families. Nuclear families are composed of married partners and their children, and this is common in industrial societies, but it's actually not the most typical form of family in the world. Some anthropologists identify a second form of nuclear family, which is a non-conjugal family, and it is composed by one parent and dependent children. On the other hand, the most common family type is the extended family. As its name says, the extended family extends beyond the nuclear or non-conjugal family and includes grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives that either live nearby or in one household. And more recently, the term family by choice has been recognized as another family type. Family by choice can include non-consanguine bonds such as adopted children, living partners, relatives of each household, and even close friends. On another hand, domestic workers provide much of the reproductive labor, such as cooking, cleaning, maintenance, care of the elderly, the children, the sick members of the family. And they often co-inhabit the same space as the families that they work for, with schedules and responsibilities that are many times extended or not clearly demarcated. This might happen because caretaking involves a certain degree of bonding and even affection that is impossible to monetize and measure. And it's often carried out by women who, in turn, need to transfer the care duties of their own children, elderly, or sick members of the family to someone else. This labor shift is usually taken by another woman in the nuclear or extended family, such as a mother, a sister, or even older daughter, and is met by the term global care chain. Domestic orbits is a research that we have been developing for some time now at the studio that analyzes how the domestic space is configured around these orbits of exclusion that shape the trajectories of domestic workers, and how that space is articulated according to specific gendered, classist, and even racist configurations of the social. So this publication and research is organized through a series of case studies that range from the 1950s until today in Mexico City. And this research looks at different scales in which the domestic labor is erased by either architects or planners. I believe that in this sense, domestic workers and domestic orbits sketches a counter history of modern architecture that actually questions the duality between the visible and invisible, and those who count and those who don't.
Welcome back. There was a lot to think about there. We are hearing the ideas of family change with age, culture, place, and context. Now, let's go a little deeper with an interview with artist, writer, and filmmaker Miranda July about how her work connects people, how she creates fictional families, and how she makes family space in film. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Hi, Miranda. Thanks for joining us. One of the themes in your work is finding ways for people to meet and talk, especially strangers. And I'm curious if today you think there's a special need for people to make new connections outside the family.
If families are these bonds, the story is they begin with romance, right? That's what makes them different from friends or blood, is the romance part. I've been reading a lot of Jungian books right now. So my head is going to, all right, the Jungian model is you see someone, you project onto them, right? There's this wonderful romantic period. That's the romance, the beginning, the building block of the family bond. And then the projection fails. They're not actually that person. They become other. The pain of that causes your soul to enlarge and transform. And that is, in fact, how we become ourselves. So yes, I think right now we are desperate to transform, like individually on a dying planet that like insists that we do. And especially like right now, having come out of, or not all of us coming out of the cocoon of the pandemic yet, but wanting badly to, and to have come out transformed. And so I guess, yeah, I feel like the problem with the family structure or the marriage structure is it doesn't, it's built on the opposite of that. It's supposed to be totally rigid because it's there to hold property, to hold property within families. So it specifically cannot transform. That would go against the whole premise of it. So I guess, yes, there's a need for it, but there's not a need right now, especially not right now, for the rigid structure of family, because that prevents the exact thing we need to do right now to survive and always have had to.
So what comes next? Like, what do you hope will be the stereotype of the 21st century family?
I mean, I'm wondering if looking back, we'll think that the beginning of the end for the nuclear family was when people started customizing their marriage vows. This is just a theory. But if you think I think for a long time, it wasn't at all something where the people getting married didn't talk at all, right? They just said, I do, maybe. But everything was done by this person in power, whoever. I think that sometimes was a religious leader, but sometimes just like the patriarch in power. So the second you have people like, well, I'm going to speak at this ceremonial binding, this structure making, that's little like, well, what might you have to say? That would imply there's something new to say. Most people just say a poem. But I think what they mean to say is, I want to do this differently. I want to do this differently from my parents. And this poem sums that up. So I guess looking forward, I'm thinking maybe the symbol of family will be the contract, because, and let's say there's different contracts and the idea is you make your own, but there's different trends. There's like the 7-year with a chance of renewal marriage contract or family contract. There's the friends cohabitating and co-parenting family contract with, the paragraph about the separate building for sex or something, and so those become something that's really shared. Like, can I look at your contract? And maybe there's not a better word than contract, but that makes so much sense. And I think we all have, at this moment, it seems quite radical to set your own rules. But gosh, isn't it easy to imagine that seeming really bizarre sort of Stepford wives that do you know, in the past, as recently as grandma's time, everyone's marriages were the same. They were supposed to last not 5 years, not 10 years, but forever. And people be like, no, well, maybe just some people did that. And anyways, that's sort of how I imagine it going.
Do you think that all families are a little bit like cults?
I started saying, well, every family is a cult, which seemed like extreme, or like a reach to be like, well, this is relatable. Every family's a cult. But I kind of meant that in the really simple sense of like, they're insulated from the rest of the world. The people in them don't know the norms of greater society. They think what they grew up in is normal and other people are weird. And I say that with some amount of humbleness, because I am doing the same thing. Like, I am a parent. We have a child. There's all kinds of things I see all the time. Like, for example, I have kind of a weird thing about curtains. Like, I don't like how they get all bunched up on one side and sort of cover a lot of the window. Just the whole premise, and like roller curtains are hard, like tricky. And so I invented this thing, and the only curtains in our house there's 3 big pegs above the window. And then I had custom made this just piece of cloth with 3 holes in it, so you can put it on and then you can take it off the 2 pegs and it just kind of hangs there, or you can just take it off altogether. It's removable. Well, I put the pegs on 2 windows, but I never actually made the second set of curtains. So almost every day I move the curtains from one room to the other, and it's just a normal thing, me carrying the curtains over to the other room and putting them on the pegs. And at one point I was like, Hopper, my child, is going to think this is what curtains are like. You just have one set in the house and you move them between the windows. And then, of course, you see one and you see them all. It's like, oh my God, every single thing in our house and that I do. And, it's all so specific, and they're going to come out into, the larger world and be like, what the fuck was that? And just as I did. And all I can say is like, open it up, like people talk about like opening, like we opened our marriage, we're opening it up, like maybe like open up the family, that's the way anyways. I mean, that's how you see how other things are done. That happens organically too, but I think it can happen sooner, and it's better if it does.
For you, what's the image of the contemporary home, like the new icon?
It's not, maybe it would be less about the building, which can be so varied, and you don't exactly want to create shame, by like saying it's one thing or another. It's maybe just about the threshold from inside to outside. And so what I think is it's just shoes at the door, like a bunch of different sized messy jumble of shoes at the door. Because especially in a city, you want to take those shoes off before you come in. And that I'm always surprised at like how many cultures that's a big deal in. It's like wearing shoes in the bed, shoes in the house. So maybe that's it. Also, in these times, I guess it'd also be like we have a hook with a lot of masks on it, So like the shoes by the door, the masks on the hooks.
What have you realized about family in this past pandemic year?
The family as cult thing is, really doubled down on when you're in quarantine, right? I mean, it's so intense. It's this pressure cooker. And I have this debate sometimes with my single friend, which is worse, to be totally single. And she doesn't even want to hear it. Like, she's like, yes, it's much worse. Like, just trust me, to be alone for a year than to be in a family. And I don't say any, she can have that. That's fine. But she's talked about how what she sees as people who previously might complain about their family or their living situation are now sort of doubled down and have become very tribal. and seem sort of like I just got to accumulate goods and wealth for my family, like we've got to survive kind of mentality. And that may just stick from here on out was her theory. And I thought, well, what you can't see is that when you don't have the option of leaving, it's safer to double down. Like you have to get with the program. It's not a good time to be like, I don't know if I feel comfortable here, so you get with the program. And I have a pretty happy family, hopefully, but I myself was noticing like, wow, there was this time where like, yes, life was really hard, but amazing how well we actually got on, given that. And yeah, we're closer and so forth. And then as soon as things started opening back up here in America, like we've had some crazy arguments. And I'm like, oh, right, we used to have these. And it's not that like we hate each other more. It's just that we can, like you don't want to get too mad at the other person without the option of leaving, just even psychologically. So when you think of how the structure functions and how like history changes that, I think it's more complicated than it would look from the outside. It's like really you're just dealing with how will I survive, and so some sort of fringe thoughts have to go away.
A lot of your early projects involved encountering strangers. What did that let you do?
Right. There's this idea that in some ways we can be more ourselves with strangers, right? That people who don't really know us. And when I first started calling people who were selling things through the penny saver classifieds, I wasn't really thinking about that, but I, the deal with LA, how it's created, Los Angeles, is you're either in your home or you're in your car. And so there's really very few places where you cross-pollinate, where your paths intersect. Like you literally have to find a way to get into someone else's home or their car, which is really frowned upon. And so this penny saver classifieds, which, I knew was in its last month probably, as no one sells things that way. They only sell them through like Craigslist. So I started calling these penny saver sellers. And, when we think about like homes, these cult-like homes, like the main reason I was doing it, I began to realize, was just the feeling of walking into a total stranger's home, the intimacy of that with their smells and their pictures and their furniture. And they don't, they're not putting on anything for you because you're just coming to buy this junk of theirs. Like they're not cleaning up for you. And then I had this premise that I would interview them about their lives, kind of somewhat starting with whatever they were selling. It was often the case that I would like cry or be trying to keep it together in those situations. Like they were not lightweight. They didn't have to be, because we didn't have to keep living with each other or ever see each other again. So there were really no repercussions, and I could go further and ask more of them in a way, and they could say more.
Thanks, Miranda. It was great talking to you.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Poppy Galanti. Now, let's listen to some contemporary architects, artists, designers, and activists from around the world. Each one has a project that relates to the family in a different way, from domestic work to how we share our homes during the daytime and the nighttime, to a new kind of care home that includes the families of residents and workers. Let's watch.
Hello, my name is Elena Schütz, and I am together with my partners Leonhard Streich and Julian Schubert heading Something Fantastic from Berlin. I'd like to talk to you about the Constellations House. The Constellations House is a design that we've developed as our personal answer to the questions, how do we live together? In which constellations do we live together? And how do the spatial needs, or the needs in general of these constellations, change over time? First of all, I'd like to throw a few themes at you that are connected to the development of the Constellations House design. So at the top, there is internal vacancy. And internal vacancy describes the fact that space within apartments is not efficiently being used. This is especially interesting in a situation like the one that we have in Berlin right now, where we're talking about a housing crisis and how we can overcome it, and if we actually need to build more, and that's, I think, the direction that we are investigating, if we can use the space within apartments that we have more efficiently. Then connected to that is the rebound effect. And the rebound effect is a term that's common in car design. And it describes the fact that the benefits that are coming from technological development and the decrease of, for example, fuel use of motors is being eaten up by the fact that cars and car designs tend to grow bigger and bigger. And there's a similar effect in housing and when you look into the space per capita that is used. Another point is the fact that people tend to build their home or acquire their home at a moment in their life when their spatial needs are the biggest. Another related effect is the remnants effect, and the remnants effect describes people not moving from one apartment to another and staying where they are. And this is especially valid in a situation of rising rents when moving into a smaller apartment almost doesn't lead to any economic benefits, just because the rents have risen in the meantime. All these effects led to us questioning actually the boundaries of an apartment, of a unit, and we were wondering if the boundaries of a unit can be more permeable. And on a second note, if the connections between rooms within a unit can actually be less rigid and allow for more flexibility. So what we did in the Constellations House concept was distributing the rooms of a unit into two different characters. So on the one hand, there are the day rooms, and on the other hand, there are the night rooms. The day rooms are living rooms and kitchens, and the night rooms are bedrooms and bathrooms. And distributing the two and setting them on two different floor plans that are then alternating through the building is allowing for more flexibility, because day rooms and night rooms can be put together in various constellations without necessarily losing the privacy within a unit or a constellation. So a constellation, be it a family or be it a different constellation, can add more people into their community by just renting another night room, either temporarily or long-term. Or if their spatial need has decreased, they can give away a night room, but they're still not losing the privacy of their constellation. So for us, the Constellations House is not only a way to try to be more efficient and also be more efficient in the way that we're using the space in the long run, but we believe that the Constellations House is also opening possibilities for a larger variety of social, communal cohabitation and living together in a more diverse way. And we believe that's also just a more interesting way to live together. Thank you.
We believe that in order to fulfill our mandate and respond to the ever more acute housing and environmental crisis around the world, the definition of architecture and an architect must be broadened to include much more than just a traditional practice model. This includes acting within the realms of not typically under the architect's purview, finance, policy, and politics. In 2017, after several years on the board, I was appointed the chair of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. Through that role, I instigated a conversation about the urban design and better city building through the lens and language that business and political audience best understands: money and numbers. I further pushed for the role of the chair to include food for thought segments and delivered them at the Chamber's monthly luncheons attended by 1,000+ business and political elite of the city. It was an economic argument, not an architectural one. Winnipeg is one of the least dense cities in the world. If Winnipeg was built to the density of Paris, it would be a mere 7.5% of its current size. Over the next 25 years, Winnipeg's population is projected to grow by about 200,000 people. With an average of 2.5 persons per household, this means that 80,000 new homes will be needed by 2045. At the same time, our infrastructure deficit is nearly $7 billion. Consider that over 70% of Winnipeg's annual budget consists of services which are directly linked to the physical distance between points. In other words, kilometers of road, meters of sewage pipe, distance driven. Research indicates that we could save about $2,000 per household per year in municipal service costs if we simply build our growth in the mature core area rather than the edges of the city. And if we apply this to the 80,000 new dwellings needed over the next 25 years, it alone would result in $4 billion savings in municipal service costs. Building a compact, thriving city that can afford to maintain its footprint also requires that we re-examine what kind of housing supply we really need. 63% of Winnipeg's households are single-family detached houses. By comparison, less than 8% of Helsinki's residents, which is my hometown with a similar population size and half the footprint, lives in a single-family house. And here's why this makes less and less sense for Winnipeggers to live this way. A vast majority, 62% of Winnipeg's households, are now 1- and 2-person families, and nearly half of those are singles. We desperately need more housing to suit this new demographic. In the 1950s, the average North American occupied about 290 square feet of floor area per person, but in 2007, that number was 900 square feet per person, accounting for 300% increase. Furthermore, Winnipeg's household size has decreased by a full person, from about 3.5 people per household to 2.5 people per household, and yet the size of our homes keeps increasing. To put it another way, the average Canadian or American each has double the residential space of the average UK, Spanish, or Italian resident, and about 3 to 4 times as much space as the average person in Japan. We often hear about the triple bottom line, making our societies ecologically, economically, and socially sustainable. Building oversized homes moves us away from sustainability on all 3 fronts. Speaking purely from an economic perspective, I'm constantly amazed that we waste an average of 10% of our floor space on the very occasional guest that may stay with us for a total of 2 weeks of the year, or 5% of the home's lifetime, both in capital and maintenance costs. And then we spend additional money to store the stuff we don't really need. For every American man, woman, and child, there are 7 square feet of self-storage space. Nearly 1 in 10 households rent storage space, up 65% in the last 15 years. Change is slow and the opposition intense, but today our research has reached Winnipeg City Hall and we appear regularly in front of political and business audiences as subject matter experts to advocate for new direction for growth, infill, accessible and affordable housing, and our data is being used by the core area councillors to push for much needed policy reform. How much space do we really need? How do we promote quality over quantity? What are the measurements of a good, happy home for a family and a sustainable planet? How should we build for the 99%, and what is the role of the architect in that equation?
We're coming to you from our apartment in Sydney, but 4 out of 5 Australians live in some type of suburban housing. So what is a suburban house? It's essentially a replicable domestic unit that's designed to house a nuclear family. And it's interesting in Australia that this Anglo-centric model of living has persisted, because the Indigenous people of Australia have tens of thousands of years of history of living in complex households based on kinship. And then there have been successive waves of migrants that have brought with them communal ways of living that are based on activity rather than rooms, such as the Malay housing shown here. So you might think that Australia has limitless space, and actually many Australians do too. But as we've made housing into an asset class, building generations of wealth upon it, the houses have gotten larger, but the plot sizes have got significantly smaller. And as these houses have increased, the number of occupants has also decreased. to the point that now only 25% of these houses actually have nuclear families living within them.
So there's obviously a disconnect between the type of housing we produce and the way that Australians live. We've spent a number of years being really interested in these conditions, and what we have to show to you today are a couple of our projects that look at this conventional mode of housing and think about how we can break down the barriers and perimeters around these houses to enable a type of shared and communal life more appropriate for how Australians live today.
So this is our project Offset House. It's based on the typical suburban McMansion. And these houses might seem like they're very sturdy, but actually they're made from lightweight timber framing, which is really good because there's 4 to 5 surplus bedrooms within them, there's wasted circulation space, too many car spaces, but quite small backyards, and they have bad environmental performance. So our project was to remove that masonry cladding and reveal the timber frame underneath. And then that timber frame provides better ventilation, better shading for the houses. And then within that new skin, we can have numerous dwellings that allow for complex living and communal living. That revealed line of timber framing provides privacy for these dwellings. That means that the fences between the houses can be removed. And then those small backyards can be combined into larger backyards that can be shared between the communities for gardening, for exercise, and for play. So the project takes the individual unit of the house and creates a framework for living rather than a product.
Of course, while we'd love that to happen, that's not what's typically happening in our suburbs. Instead, what we're finding is developers are moving in and they're buying up multiple lots of single houses, consolidating them into larger sites and building on top of them larger monolithic apartment buildings to take advantage of rising property prices. Now, these apartment buildings bring with them greater density, sure, but they really just perpetuate that individualised mode of housing. They create little shoeboxes that are predicated on the same type of unit in each one. Our project Newground, which we developed with Andy Fergus, Alicia Posniak and Openwork in Melbourne, is seen as a kind of step change between the scale of the individual house and the greater density of the apartment building. It's essentially a layer cake that provides one story of super efficient apartment building plinth as a tabletop for single and double story lightweight housing to be built on top. That table is a bit like the consolidated suburban backyard of Offset House. There are no fences, there's one horizontal plane, and neighbours can interact and share space across it. Because the single and story lightweight volumes are simply placed on top, they're infinitely reconfigurable, and we can imagine lots of different household types suitable to different family structures, suitable to different types of duration. All in all, a kind of village that brings together a diversity of different families and occupants. It's very clear to us that Australia is in a state of change and that we have a whole lot of different types of household models that are very different to what the nuclear family was or might be seen as today. Given that we still have this type of housing, we accept these conditions in our projects, but what we're thinking is if the family in Australia has changed, our housing should too.
This body of work has coincided with my own decade-long care crisis between my young son and my grandmother who needed care in the twilight of her life. And what I kept on running up against was that part of this crisis is related to the way that we build cities and homes in North America, which is, built around this idea or this notion of the nuclear family and the single unit home.
And Marisa approached me with this really intriguing concept of can we design a building that would allow elders and caregivers to live in the same building and support each other. And so we developed this design, which we called Care House. And this is its first iteration as a 5-story building in the city of Baltimore. And the way that Care House works, in this project, we have 5 stories, 3 stories for elders and some for family care. And we have one level for caregivers, and we have one level for residency. And they all meet in the center part of the building, as you can see here. in a series of shared spaces that collect or around which the independent units are clustered, but the spaces are connected between them through terraces and through an internal stair. That way, you can create different degrees of sharing and cohabitation around those shared spaces and support.
What we're looking at and interested in is how can we create new forms of sharing and mutualizing care and living to meet the care crisis which we find ourselves in and which will only escalate through the year 2050. This is an opportunity to rethink how we can create new forms to support new forms of solidarity, but also how we can create and integrate art and architecture to inspire us to, again, rebuild our cities and our homes to center care.
Our design motivation for Care House is to create a dignified living environment for elders and for caregivers and their families. So both groups can support each other, but also become an active participant in our communities and in our society.
What we're designing against is this idea of senior living where our older and disabled members of our families are put in out of sight, out of mind, hospital-like institutional settings, and then they quickly, their health quickly declines, and we never see them, especially, of course, as we know in the pandemic. We're also designing against this model of where domestic work, which is an industry characterized by high turnover and low wages, remains unsustainable. So this is a key time for us now to rethink and redesign new systems and new structures and build new forms in ways that dignify the labor of care and this precious part that is part of each of our lives.
In the first decade of the 20th century, the collision of escalating consumerism and patriarchal family life appeared to be unstoppable. Thor, the first electric washing machine, was sold by Hurley Laundry Company in 1907. The Model T automobile was released by Henry Ford's production lines in 1908. Popular culture was dominated by visions and idealistic objects for single households. Washing machines for one operator, automobiles with 4 passengers. Decadent temples for consumerism were built throughout the West. This is where James Spangler manifested an idea that would come to revolutionize the way we live together. The janitor of the Zollinger department store with miles of carpet under their jurisdiction. Spangler was growing sick as their struggle with asthma was intensifying due to the dust-producing work of carpet sweeping. One evening, Spangler took a motor from an old electric fan, a pillowcase from the store, and an old wooden soapbox, and fixed them to an old carpet sweeper. This was the first prototype of the personal suction cleaning device, briefly known as a vacuum cleaner, or a Hoover, in some parts of the world. Spangler's youngest, Jenny, took over the development of the suction device for a further decade, until the GDP, the tool we all know so well today, went into production. A young radical, uninspired by the politics of the day, Jenny Spangler was influenced by memories of laundry trips with their elders, where domestic labor was collective and sociable. The new device was designed to be used only by 3 people acting together. One can be forgiven for thinking that humans were doomed to live in lonely familial kinship units forever, but culture was starting to shift. Kitchens grew larger to accommodate collective cooking, whilst dining tables got longer, and households became commune halls with large sleeping quarters and communal habit rooms. Housework was collectivized and celebrated as a shared ritual with kinsfolk. In response, the modern movement was overhauled by a new generation, focused on designing for a new world where we design for care, not for growth.
The gross domestic product is a fictional prototype for collectivizing domestic labor. As an alternative to the capitalist assumption that housework is most efficient when performed individually, the GDP is a device that must be used by 3 people simultaneously. The tailor's tools designed for domestic labor are often designed for solo use, from the lawnmower to the microwave to the Hoover. These tools are also often designed to be used privately, and are therefore complicit in the patriarchal system of unpaid reproductive work that happens behind the scenes. The project seeks to challenge the rituals that surround these props by making simple tweaks to traditional domestic spaces and objects. The GDP explores the domestic realm as a political project, rather than a space that has organically grown out of an innate natural human behavior. As the base unit of our current socioeconomic system, the nuclear family and its home is a key starting point when trying to rethink the way we live together.
I'm your host, Greta Enthusiasmo, and that's the end of tonight's programme. Societal transformations have always inspired architectural interventions. The built environment houses our rituals, our norms, and our cultural patterns. Architecture mirrors back to us our collective values. However, today's society and architecture are no longer in sync, and parts of contemporary life are not aligned with the spaces they occupy. Exploring changing ideas of family is only one part of this reflection on contemporary life, but it is a crucial one. We must ask these questions, otherwise we could find ourselves living in spaces shaped by values that no longer represent a shared vision of who we are. Thank you for watching Catching Up with Life. I'll see you next week when we ask, the museum, is it enough? Good night and good news.